The official story says J.P. Morgan pulled funding from Wardenclyffe because Tesla's vision was impractical. A tower broadcasting free energy to the world? Too expensive, too risky. Marconi's wireless communication was the safer bet. But what if the real reason was simpler and darker? Free energy cannot be metered, controlled, or monetized. You cannot send a bill for power pulled from the air itself. We're going to challenge the simple villain narrative. Morgan wasn't acting alone. He represented an entire financial system incompatible with Tesla's dream. Then we'll explore what actually would have happened if he'd been forced to see it through. The tower activates. The world changes forever. Morgan wasn't a villain in a vacuum. He represented an entire financial system built on metering and control. To understand why Wardenclyffe died, we have to understand the war of the currents, the brutal competition between Edison, Westinghouse, and a dozen other firms racing to build centralized, billable electric infrastructure across America. The logic was simple. You build power plants. You run copper wire to homes and factories. You install meters. You send bills. Every kilowatt hour is tracked, priced, and collected. The entire investment model depended on predictable, controllable revenue streams. Morgan's banking philosophy reflected this perfectly. He only invested in what could be financed through steady cash flow. Railroads worked because you could charge per mile. Steel mills worked because you sold tonnage. Electric utilities worked because you metered consumption. Tesla's fatal flaw was proposing a system with no meters, no bills, no revenue model. Wardenclyffe promised power transmission through the earth itself, free for anyone with the right receiver. How do you finance that? How do you pay back the construction loans when customers can pull unlimited energy without paying a cent when Marconi demonstrated wireless communication? In 1901, Morgan saw something Tesla missed. Communication could be controlled. You could charge for telegraph messages, for access to the network, for the equipment itself. It was monetizable. The withdrawal wasn't personal. Historians like Mark Seifer and W. Bernard Carlson have documented this extensively. Morgan didn't betray Tesla out of malice. He recognized a structural incompatibility with industrial capitalism itself. The deeper implication goes beyond one investor's profit. Free energy challenges the entire utility model. It threatens every power company, every coal mine, every investor who'd sunk capital into the existing grid. The system couldn't absorb it. But what if Morgan had been convinced, or forced by competition, to see it through? What if another financier, desperate to corner a new market, had funded the final construction phase? What world emerges when energy becomes truly free? That's where the investigation turns speculative. We have to ask, what happens to an industrial economy built on scarcity when the most fundamental resource, power itself, becomes abundant and uncontrollable? The answer is more complex than Tesla ever imagined. Wardenclyffe activates successfully. Within months, Tesla demonstrates global power transmission. A factory in Chicago powers its assembly line by pulling energy directly from the atmosphere. A farmhouse in rural Kansas lights up without a single wire running to the property. The first casualty is the centralized electric utility industry. General Electric, Westinghouse, Commonwealth Edison. Every company that spent decades building power plants and stringing copper wire across the continent watches its infrastructure investments become obsolete overnight. The copper network they fought so hard to build, worthless. The coal-fired generators, monuments to a dead era. But the real shockwave hits the petroleum industry. Standard Oil, the most powerful monopoly in American history, faces an existential crisis. Gasoline demand collapses as vehicles are retrofitted with Tesla antennae. The internal combustion engine doesn't disappear immediately, but the economic incentive to refine petroleum evaporates. Why pay for fuel when power is free? The global implications are immediate and catastrophic. Nations built on oil exports, Russia, Persia, Mexico, face revenue crises they cannot manage. The Russian Empire, already unstable, loses a critical income stream just as revolutionary pressure builds. Persia's nascent petroleum agreements with Britain become irrelevant before the ink dries. By 1910, the Rockefeller Empire disintegrates, not through antitrust action, not through government intervention, but through simple irrelevance. Standard Oil's monopoly shatters because nobody needs what it's selling. The company that once controlled 90% of American oil refining becomes a footnote. The financial panic spreads through every investment portfolio tied to energy infrastructure. Billions in capital, adjusted for inflation, we're talking trillions today, simply vanishes. Banks holding utility bonds face insolvency. Pension funds invested in coal mining companies collapse. The economic disruption rivals the Great Depression, except it happens in a single decade. But Morgan and the other financiers don't simply accept defeat, they pivot. If they cannot meter the power itself, they'll control access to it. They begin acquiring patents, rare materials, and tower construction contracts. New monopolies emerge for a new era. The critical question becomes, who controls access to the technology, the patents, and the infrastructure required to receive free power? Because Tesla may have made energy abundant, but he didn't make the means of accessing it free. Receiver technology requires specialized components. Advanced antennae need rare materials. The towers themselves must be built, maintained, and strategically positioned. Suddenly, the scarcity shifts from energy to the tools required to harness it. Morgan and his peers recognize this immediately. They establish licensing agreements. They patent receiver designs. They control the supply chains for critical materials. The monopoly doesn't disappear, it just relocates. By 1915, a new economic order takes shape. Energy is free, but access is not. The companies that adapt fastest, those that pivot from selling power to selling the means of receiving it, survive and thrive. Those that cling to the old model vanish. Humanity doesn't escape scarcity, it just finds new ways to manufacture it. The world Tesla created isn't the utopia he imagined. It's something stranger, more complex, and in some ways more troubling. Because the fundamental human impulse to control resources and dominate markets hasn't changed. Only the battlefield has shifted. The most unexpected consequence of free energy isn't economic, it's geographic. For the first time in industrial history, location stops mattering. Rural areas, previously dependent on expensive grid extensions that might never arrive, gain instant access to unlimited power. A farm in Montana can run the same machinery as a factory in Detroit. A village in Appalachia has the same energy capacity as Manhattan. The economic advantage of clustering near power plants and rail lines evaporates overnight. Urbanization reverses. The Great Migration to cities, which defined the late 19th century, begins moving backward. Why tolerate crowded tenements and factory smoke when you can power a workshop from your own land? By 1925, we see major population movements away from industrial centers towards self-sufficient rural communities. The demographic shift reshapes the political landscape. Cities lose population and therefore political influence. Rural regions gain economic independence they've never possessed. The balance of power between urban industrialists and rural farmers fundamentally changes. New economic models emerge almost immediately. Local manufacturing, powered by free energy, competes directly with centralized factories. A blacksmith in Iowa can run electric forges that rival Pittsburgh steel mills. A textile cooperative in rural Georgia can operate looms without paying a cent for power. The economies of scale that favored massive urban factories diminish, but the control mechanisms adapt faster than Tesla's supporters anticipated. Governments and corporations recognize they cannot meter energy, so they shift focus to controlling the means of access. The patents, the tower locations, the specialized components, these become the new choke points. The rare earth element bottleneck emerges as the critical constraint. Advanced antennae, high-efficiency receivers, and transmission equipment require materials like neodymium, dysprosium, and yttrium. These elements, barely understood in 1915, become more valuable than gold by 1925. Nations with significant redeposits suddenly hold geopolitical leverage previously reserved for oil states. China's vast rare earth reserves in Inner Mongolia become strategically critical. Scandinavian deposits in Sweden and Norway transform those nations into power brokers. Parts of Africa, previously ignored by colonial powers focused on rubber and diamonds, become targets for a new scramble. The colonial powers recognize the shift immediately. Britain, France, Germany, and the United States race to secure mining rights and establish control over resupply chains. The methods are familiar: treaties, coercion, outright occupation, but the target resources are entirely new. Tower construction sites become the second critical resource. The main Wardenclyffe-style transmission towers require specific geographic conditions: stable bedrock, minimal electromagnetic interference, strategic positioning for maximum coverage. Nations fight for control over these locations with the same intensity they once fought over naval bases and coal deposits. By 1930, the world has adapted to free energy, but the fundamental dynamics of power and control remain unchanged. The resource curse hasn't disappeared, it's simply relocated from oil fields to rare earth mines and tower control zones. The political consequence is profound but predictable. Energy independence weakens centralized state power in some ways, but governments compensate by tightening control over the new critical resources. Regulatory frameworks emerge to license receiver technology. International treaties attempt to govern tower construction and re-extraction. Tesla's vision of democratized energy collides with the reality of human systems built on hierarchy and control. The technology changes, the power structures adapt. The shift in global conflict becomes undeniable by 1930. Wars are no longer fought over oil fields and shipping lanes. The new battlegrounds are tower control zones and rare earth supply chains. Geography still matters, but for entirely different reasons. Nations fight to control the land surrounding major Wardenclyffe-style transmission towers. A 50-mile radius around each tower becomes strategically critical, not for the power it transmits, but for the ability to regulate who receives it and on what terms. The strategic calculus changes completely. Naval supremacy, once measured by coal bunkers and refueling stations, now depends on controlling coastal tower sites that can project power across oceans. Mountain ranges that once served as natural barriers become prime real estate for high-altitude transmission stations. The 1940s bring the inevitable conflict. A major global war erupts, but the motivations are fundamentally different from our timeline. Nations don't fight over ideology or Lebensraum or imperial ambitions fueled by resource scarcity. They fight over access to the materials and infrastructure that enable free energy. The technology transfer wars become the primary theater of espionage. Every major power runs intelligence operations focused on stealing Tesla-derived patents and recruiting engineers who understand the transmission systems. The scientists who can optimize receiver efficiency or improve tower range become more valuable than generals. The arms race takes a peculiar form. Nations compete to build the most powerful, longest-range transmission towers to project energy dominance. A tower in Berlin that can reach Moscow becomes a weapon of economic warfare. The nation that controls the most efficient receiver technology can effectively blockade rivals by controlling access to critical components. The evidence from our own timeline supports this pattern. Human conflict has never stemmed primarily from energy scarcity. It stems from the desire to control what others need. Oil didn't cause wars because it was scarce. It caused wars because controlling it meant controlling industrial capacity, military mobility, and economic leverage. In the Tesla world, the fuel source changes, but the fundamental power dynamics remain identical. The nations that control rare earth mines in China and Africa hold the same geopolitical leverage that Saudi Arabia holds in our timeline. The difference is the resource being controlled, not the impulse to control it. This alternate history reveals an uncomfortable truth. Tesla's vision could have changed the technology, but not the human systems built on hierarchy, competition, and control. Free energy doesn't eliminate conflict, it redirects it toward new scarcity points that humans inevitably create. The official narrative protects a simple story. One man stopped progress. The deeper implication is that the system itself, capital, control, metering, was fundamentally incompatible with true freedom. Even in the Tesla world, new hierarchies emerged around access and materials. Humanity manufactured scarcity where abundance existed. The question for today, are we repeating the same pattern with renewable energy, cryptocurrency, and digital infrastructure? Do we build systems of genuine democratization, or do we simply relocate the choke points? If you value this kind of investigation into the hidden forces that shape history, subscribe for more analysis. Let me know in the comments, what is your assessment of this alternate timeline?